English translation, 679th contact Monday, the 10th of April 2017, 21:51 hours.
Hello, greetings, Ptaah, dear friend, and also welcome as usual, for it is always and at all times a great pleasure to me when you come here.
Greetings, Edouard, dear friend. It is also always a pleasure for me, and thanks for your welcome.
With your permission, I would like to get straight to some things we should talk about.
Of course.
You Playaran are, after all, following the killing spree of the Civil War, as well as everything relating to the Islamic State is, so I would like to know what happened there about a week ago. It was, if I give the date correctly, last Tuesday morning, the 4th of April, around 6:30 hours in the north of Syria, when the town of Khan Shaykhou was attacked from the air, and poison gas bombs were dropped. Khan Shaykhou, which is called Chan Shaychun and Chan Shaykun in Europe, belongs to the province of Idlib and lies between the large cities of Aleppo and Hama. Aleppo is the capital of the governorate of the same name. And I actually know this city under the Turkish name Halep and under Kurdish Helep, as well as Halab, where, as you know, I have been several times. Syria is a multi-ethnic state that has been ruled and oppressed by the al-Assad family for decades. When I was in Syria officially for the first time in 1963, not the 3 times illegally with your father Sfath and with Asket, but formally, it happened that I came from Turkey, and after the border crossing at Bab al-Hawa, which means Gate of the Winds, I went straight to Halep, or rather Halab, where I stopped at a tea room in the evening and was approached by a policeman who knew German and asked where I was from and where I was going. After which he took me to a hotel where I could eat and spend the night free of charge. In the hotel, I also met a man who spoke German and English, introduced himself to me with his first name as Sheikh Anas, and who was in the hotel with his harem of 23 women. When I was interested in the nature of the harem, he said that I seemed very trustworthy to him, following which he asked his wives if they would allow me to talk to them, which was apparently no problem for them. So he sat back down in his chair and asked me to go into the room to his harem women without him having to come along. Astonished at first, of course, I asked him if that was his serious word, which he confirmed. Then, of course, I went to the women, who were all unveiled, which again amazed me. When I had introduced myself to them, pleasant and, for me, interesting conversations ensued with them for about 25 or 30 minutes, which was not difficult because some of the women spoke German and others could speak English. Then, the other morning, I was told that a statewide uprising would break out today, and that everyone was worried about my safety, so I should leave the country. And since I really wanted to go to Damascus and then to Jordan, the policeman who had been informed about the upcoming uprising took me to the appropriate bus station, where I was taken without payment to Damascus via Hama and Homs. Fortunately, I was still able to stay in the youth hostel there, although the announced uprising was already in full swing, and I had also been ordered by the president to stay out. The new Syrian president Nazim al-Qudsi tried to remove the pro-unionist officers, including Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, from the military, fearing a violent overthrow. When I became interested in this man, I learned that he was a Sunni and born in Halep, or Aleppo, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire when he was born in the early 1900s. However, Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, then played a leading role in the takeover of power by the Ba'ath Party in 1963, whereby, as was explained to me by insurgents, he also ordered in Damascus what I was able to observe and witness myself, namely that he had an Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun placed on the street and fired with it into the middle of a crowd of human beings. In response to my later inquiries as to where such an anti-aircraft gun came from, which it actually was, I later learned from a Syrian officer that it had been brought into the country through the arms black market. It was a weapon that had been developed in Switzerland, about which I found the following data days ago when I was looking for corresponding records.
The mobile anti-aircraft gun is a twin 35mm cannon or anti-aircraft gun, which consisted of 2 cannons of the KD series of the former Swiss company Oerlikon since 2009 Rheinmetall Air Defense. Originally, this weapon system was designated 2ZLAR-353ML, but was later changed to GDF-001. Although this anti-aircraft gun was developed in the 1950s, it is still used today in more than 30 countries. As an Air Force officer, Hafiz al-Assad brought the Dumair Air Base near Damascus under control for the party, where the entire Air Force of Syria was stationed. I also read a few days ago that he was Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party and Prime Minister from 1970 to 1971, then President from 1971 to 2000, and ruled the country dictatorially from 1970 to 2000. He was addicted to so-called leftist nationalism and oriented himself mostly towards the Soviet Union. After his death in 2000, his son Bashar al-Assad succeeded him as the new president in Syria, but he is not a bit better than his father, and actually even worse. For decades, Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, terrorized and oppressed the entire Syrian population, and after his death in 2000, his son Bashar al-Assad succumbed to the same machinations that have persisted up to the present day. As a result of which his father and he, together with their family clan, suppressed all tension in the multi-ethnic state of Syria with evil Gewalt, 1, and to the extent of murder and mass executions. But the time came in 2011, when the Arab populations rose up against their dictators and despots in the form of the Arab Spring, whereby protests also took place in Syria, as predicted more than 2,000 years ago by Emmanuel's Talmud Emmanuel, the 25th chapter, verse 10, page 193:
For many people will rise up against its government, one people against another, and one kingdom against another. And there will come times of privation, hardship, and misery, and thus earthquakes and immense storms, and floods all about in an endless number.
In a very short time a civil war arose from it, in which since then Sunnis fight against Alawites, Shiites, and Christians. To eliminate his opponents, namely the Sunnis, Bashar al-Assad resorted to drastic means, such as mass executions and systematic torture. And later on he ordered barrel bombs from planes and helicopters to be dropped on the population and the adversary troops, just as he also let massive numbers of human beings be murdered with poison gas. Effectively, dictator Assad turned an entire country into rubble and ashes, and this chaos in Syria and all the countless militias and fronts benefited the Islamist state. With the Assad terror and the civil war in Syria, a new field of activity for militant jihadists emerged from 2011. AQI ISIS, led by former prisoner Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi since 2010, also went to Syria with its fighters and founded the al-Nusra Front there as a new al-Qaeda offshoot. In April 2013, al-Baghdadi announced the merger of both groups to form the Islamic State. In fact, fundamentally, Islamist State ISIS, in Iraq and in Syria. But this led to the strategic and ideological rift with the al-Qaeda leadership under Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the effective successor of Osama bin Laden. As a result of this split, the Islamistic State primarily fought competing jihadist groups in Syria, thereby, however, avoiding direct fighting with the army of the Syrian ruler Bashar al-Assad. Especially in northern Syria, the terrorist militia conquered large areas. In order to fight the Islamist State, although Europe and the USA also intervened militarily in the conflict, Russia was called in by Bashar al-Assad on the Syrian side as help against the parties hostile to Assad. Thus, Russian President Vladimir Putin also justifies the airstrikes in Syria with the fight against the Islamist State. Although Russian bombs also hit positions of the rebels fighting on a war on two fronts against the IS and Assad. This cruel war in Syria has driven millions of refugees out of the country, who have now reached around 12 million, while hundreds of thousands have perished. Russia's aid to Assad is for geopolitical reasons, and namely the whole thing tends towards maintaining the Syrian dictator's power, who is providing Russia with a naval base, which Putin of course wants to preserve. To be precise, this is the naval base Tartus, which is a naval station of the Syrian Navy in the Syrian port city of Tartus. This Syrian naval base covers an area of 0.4 square kilometers and 40 ha respectively, but it also houses on an area of 1.5 hectares a small base, which is actually only a technical base of the Russian Navy, and a pier, which essentially consists of 2 floating jetties, each 120 m long. The naval base in Tartus has been co-used by the Soviet Union since the signing of a corresponding bilateral agreement between the USSR and Syria in 1971. At present, it is the only base maintained by the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean, which is why it is very important for Russia to be able to retain it, which is why the Russian aid to Assad consists of preserving this naval base. In order to be able to do this, however, from the Russian perspective, it is necessary to support the Assad regime with the Russian Air Force in the fight against the insurgents, Al-Qaeda and the Islamist State, which of course does not suit the USA because they claim the Mediterranean for themselves but have to share it with Russia, which can be present in the Mediterranean through its base in Tartus. But now back to what I have actually mentioned in general, namely the toxic gas bomb attack on Khan Shaykhun. Shortly after this attack, eyewitnesses reported afflicted patients suffering from acute respiratory distress. Everything points to the fact that chemicals or toxic gas were released during the air raid, which must have caused the respiratory problems. As I have already said, there is civil war and Islamist terror in Syria, with the Syrian army, that is to say Bashar al-Assad's army, with ground troops in the air force, but also Russia and the USA participating in the fight against the Islamist State, in particular through air attacks, which Russia is also conducting against the Syrian insurgents fighting against Bashar al-Assad's troops. But as far as the poison gas attack is concerned, Assad denies it, which is why I would like to know what is really behind it. So, my long speech also has the purpose of hearing from you about your observations regarding the toxic gas attack.
When Bashar al-Assad distances himself from it, that is his right, because he had actually nothing to do with the poison gas attack of the 4th of April 2017. All that happened was based on a well-thought-out intrigue aimed at dissuading Russia from its course of helpfulness for Syria. On the other hand, the secretly appointed was also responsible for the installation of the toxic gas bombs, as well as for spreading the rumor that Assad had given the order for the attack so as to tempt Trump to distance himself from his Russia friendliness, because Russia was, after all, pro-Assad. Truthfully, the whole of this deceit and lethal intrigue was thought up to the smallest detail by and by, after which this war crime was arranged by the crucial and carried out by the Syrian Air Force. The pilots, however, were during this process not informed about their real bomb load, as a result of which they had no idea that sarin toxic gas bombs had been slipped under them, whereby many people then died as a result of the release of the mustard nerve gas. And this was done in this way. On the other hand, in order to dissuade the fickle and politically inexperienced U.S. President Trump from his friendliness towards Russia and from his idea and his promise no longer to interfere in foreign countries' affairs in a warlike manner, etc., but first and foremost to place only the United States of America in the spotlight. Allah America first. And these two factors, which run uninhibitedly counter to his election promise in this regard, have already been so strongly put into and transformed his world of thoughts that he is acting contrary to his own words and wishes. That was not very difficult with this man, because as a non-politician he is in no way familiar with the political intrigues and is easily duped by his advisors, etc. Those who advise him know how to influence him through his feelings and fine spiritual perceptions and are due to his political inconsiderateness, inexperience, and impulsiveness able to guide him according to their will.
Well, I saw the whole thing in a similar way, because the toxic gas camps of Assad were already officially neutralized and destroyed years ago. Consequently, the attack with toxic gas in Khan Shaykhun could not be carried out by an order of Bashar al-Assad, but indeed by and Syria's regime is therefore not responsible for the toxic gas attack on Khan Shaykhun. and that Trump has an impulsive disposition is a matter of course for me, for, as the term impulsivity also implies, he is acting too, namely extremely confused and recklessly. Thus he shows a behavior in which he reacts unthinkingly spontaneously, and without any consideration of even obvious consequences to external stimuli or internal impulses. Consequently, he acts inappropriate to the situation, uncontrolled and unthoughtful. And since the advisors know this, they have an easy game of enticing him into unconsidered decisions and actions by him inwardly growing angry in response to the advices and taking false impulsive decisions and acting according to them. And that this is effectively the case was best illustrated by his reaction to the toxic gas attack in Syria, to which he reacted hopping madly with a completely stupid military strike, that is to say with a rocket fire, from an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean to a Syrian Air Force base, and thereby conjured up political differences with Russia. A fact, however, which was taken into account and calculated by his advising Russia hostile elements. And the fact that U.S. President Donald Trump brought a military strike against the Assad regime into play was really the stupidest thing he could do. Because on the one hand, he thereby broke his election promise that the USA would no longer interfere in the affairs of foreign states, especially with regard to offensive acts of warfare, and so on. On the other hand, however, as the matter now appears, his advisors already haul him that badly over the coals that because of their influence he acts without will, of his own and thoughtlessly as well as unthoughtfully impulsively according to their intent and will.
What you are describing is right.
There is certainly nothing more to be said about anything. For my part, though, I have something else that interests me that I want to talk about.
Of course, because you are never short of necessary things to talk about.
Good, thanks. Today I once again have some questions concerning the peoples of Era and their behavior in relation to various things such as work, state of consciousness, ethics, criminality and crime, etc., as well as the offspring of you Ptaah. It would be good if you would explain how it is with you on Era with the duty to work and with the responsibility for it. It would also be good to say something about unemployment, as you could also explain some other time how it is with the emigration of people who move to other peoples. It also seems that it is necessary to say something about the refugee system, which comes about on Earth as a result of uprisings, revolutions, terror, wars, and persecution, but also as a result of unemployment, misery, hardship, hunger, and greed for prosperity, as is the case here on Earth, where the number of human beings is becoming more and more precarious, more and more insane, and where overpopulation is becoming more and more blatant. Then also this. The other day you said that you have a total adult population of around 530 million, and around 110 million offspring under the age of 140. Unfortunately, I made another mistake when retrieving and transcribing the conversation, namely that I forgot a 0 at 14, which meant that 14 was written instead of 140. This caused a core group member to have doubts, because this could not be, and practically corresponded to a discrepancy.
As I explained in an earlier conversation, the peoples on Era remain among themselves, and only very few persons emigrate to other peoples, whereby the reason for this is usually living together with other members of the peoples, or if there is some unavoidable need to do so. Otherwise, the individual peoples remain among themselves and preserve their own folk customs and traditions, etc. With this, I also explained that there are no migrations of peoples on Era, but also no refugees for any reason, because there are no uprisings or even wars on Era, etc. Consequently, there are also no reasons for a flight from one people to another. There is also no hunger among the peoples of Era, for since we Ptaah adhere to the planetary requirements for the preservation of all life, so in relation to Ptaahanian humanity, nature and all its fauna and flora on the land, in the waters and in the air, the entire natural food cultivation and the further food production for the entire Era humanity can be produced in abundance without any problems. As far as unemployment is concerned, which you mention, we Ptaah do not have it, because all Pleiaren of both sexes are comprehensively integrated into our planet-wide system of labor regulation. So there are also no work-shy persons on Era who would exhibit parasitic behavior, as is often the case with Earth humans. Also, with regard to criminality and crime, there are none among the human beings of Era, for the evolutionary stage of consciousness and ethics and their stability of value, as well as the resulting sense of duty and responsibility, are so highly developed in every Pleiaren human being that negative deviations no longer appear. And as far as our Pleiaren descendants under 140 years of age are concerned, I think it is quite understandable that from an Earth human being's point of view, a discrepancy is seen in it if, as a result of an error, you have written an age of 14 instead of 140. But this can be corrected and has no significance because it can be put right. Nevertheless, Earth humans are ignorant of our Pleiaren birth regime, which, however, would be useless to explain because it could not be carried out on Earth. According to our birth regulation, it is to be explained that it is regulated on the one hand according to our high life expectancy, and on the other hand according to the number of the population, from which it results that consequently on Era, the descendants are also to be determined according to the deaths, as, however, also according to various other necessary regulations, which can only be made when a humanity has reached a necessary high level of consciousness, as is the case with our Pleiaren peoples. These regulations, I would call them, could not yet be understood by Earth humans because the necessary reason for them has not yet been created. It is also to be assumed, which cannot yet be understood by Earth humans, that on the one hand their average lifespan at the present time is 75 to 80 years, while on the other hand it is about 1,000 years for us. As a rule, Earth humans produce several offspring between the ages of 18 and 45, whereby in third world countries often up to 12 offspring are produced per family, which contributes enormously to overpopulation. But also in industrialized countries in closed alliances or open relationships, often up to 4 or more offspring are produced and born within about 2.5 decades, which also drives the population up horrendously. This is in contrast to us Pleiaren, who are entitled to beget offspring at the age of 70 at the earliest, after which it can then take several hundred years until the next offspring is begotten, perhaps 200 or 300 years. If at all, for the rule is, which is privately observed as an unwritten law, that offspring are first begotten only at the age after 150 years. And this is so because all members of the population, without exception, learn several other fields of activity beyond the normal learning activity which lasts until the age of about 70. Only then are all the main activity trainings completed, after which one enters into full and all-round active life. In comparison with us, I calculate this to be 26 to 28 years in the case of Earth humans, as it is only at this age that descendants should be conceived. And since with us Pleiaren, each marital alliance or other cohabitation may only produce 3 offspring, the fixed number of adults of about 530 million and of 110 million offspring under 140 years of age can be maintained by the regulation of our birth control. The total Pleiaren population of the world is regulated in such a way that it always remains approximately the same, which nevertheless means that the number of offspring can fall or rise by a few million, so that the number of around 110 million is not always exactly constant. On the one hand, offspring may only be begotten on request, but on the other hand, it can also occur that as a result of various natural circumstances or necessities, more or fewer procreations are permitted. So when I gave the figure of about 530 million adults and 110 million errands under 140 years of age, these figures correspond to the present time.
Your birth rate could not be introduced on Earth, I think. And the question, with regard to the peoples, Are there no problems there with regard to the birth control that has been ordered?
For birth control as we are doing, Earth humans would have to have our Pleiaren level of consciousness and ethics and responsibility, but that will take a very, very, very long time to achieve. And until Earth humans reach this stage, they will also not be able to understand how our birth control system functions and can be carried out. As a result of which a discrepancy or disproportionality or a disproportion, a contradiction is suspected and assumed. And as for your further question, no, there are no problems. Because among our Pleiaren peoples, logical reason and logical reasoning are factors and values acquired thousands of years ago, which have become such a matter of course and for the benefit of the entire Iranian population that not even a suggestion of breaking the rule appears.
I can imagine. But then the matter is now clarified, so there should be no further misunderstanding. What you have now said with regard to the learning of diverse and varied activities, which we call vocational training here, you once told me that often 20 to 30 or even more fields of activity are learned, which are also practiced alternately throughout your lifetime. Your father Shvath also explained this to me and taught me in this regard that I should also do this in my life, because I must master everything I have learned well when I begin and carry out my task. So in my lifetime I acted according to his instructions and learned a great deal from various trades, which I was then able to use very well in building up the center and can still use it, even though since my health breakdown I can only do it according to instructions. Although I have acquired a lot of manual skills and knowledge from various professions, these were not actual vocational training, but only short courses in which I learned the most important things. But they were sufficient for me to be able to do the necessary work for setting up the center. Of course, all the group members worked diligently and gave me a helping hand when I did the main work. But I had to do it myself because none of the staff understood anything about the various technical tasks during the construction of the center.
What you said at the beginning of our conversation about spelling mistakes, unfortunately hearing or spelling mistakes cannot be avoided, just as speech mistakes cannot be avoided either. And as I said before, you do a very demanding job with the retrieval and written recording of our conversations, which also requires a correspondingly profound concentration as well as a certain speed of writing. Consequently, it is understandable if spelling mistakes occur.
This is probably as you say, but it is not understood by certain people among the readership of the contact conversations, because they maliciously look for spelling mistakes in order to split hairs and look for attacks to refute what has been explained and expounded. In this way they believe they can expose and portray me as a fraud and a swindler, by which they mean themselves to be boundlessly big and clever in order to let themselves appear in a shining light.
Resentment, know-it-allness, malice, jealousy, meanness, impertinence, ill will, envy, baseness, viciousness, deceitfulness, and ill will are unfortunately the mainspring of many wretched, selfish, self-centered, inconsiderate, and selfish Earth humans.
Sadly, it is indeed so. They are pathetic characters who hate themselves and therefore want to defame others because they feel unsatisfied in every aspect of their lives and are also stupid and uneducated.
Which is undeniable.
But something else. As you once told me, on Era you also radiate catastrophic events from alien planets worldwide, as well as in relation to natural disasters and overpopulation, which perhaps also contributes to the fact that from the Era population purely psychologically there is a satisfaction and recognition in relation to the whole Aran forms of order. In addition, I think that Pleiaren humanity is oriented towards this, and accordingly also works to ensure that everything on Era remains in good order in every way. For my part, I think that such emanations can have a good psychological effect, because there is no indifference among your humanity, as is unfortunately the case with the majority of Earthlings. However, this would not be successful with many of Earth's indifferent humanity, as is also the case since radio, television, and cinema have been around.
Unfortunately, this is indeed as you say. And with regard to the entire Iranian world population, it is made aware again and again of the disasters and calamities that occur through overpopulation. So, planet-wide, information broadcasts are repeatedly broadcast, through which catastrophic conditions of uprisings, torture, war, murder, revolutions, terror, strife, misery and distress, hunger, diseases, epidemics, and terror, etc. on overpopulation worlds are pointed out. The reason, however, is not that of deterrence, but purely informative, to show what generally unpeaceful and barbarous conditions still prevail on those worlds, which in every respect are still millions of years behind our entire Pleiadian high development. The whole thing also has an instructive character in regard to the very early past of our primitive peoples, which occurred in the same or a similar framework, as is also still the case today in a very lasting way on other and still extremely uncivilized worlds and among their peoples, as is also the case with regard to the earthly world population. The majority of Earth humans are still extremely uncultivated, barbaric, boorish, rude, wild, and savage, although the erroneous opinion prevails among the majority and they are subject to the fallacy of being highly civilized, very philanthropic, humane, and thus also concerned with the welfare of their fellow human beings, as well as with all life of fauna and flora.
A clear word, which unfortunately really applies to the bulk of the earthly population. Earth's humanity has from time immemorial been and is also today unconcerned about the natural disasters of all kinds that have been caused by the machinations of overpopulation and continue to be caused by the rampant increase in overpopulation. For some time now, it has become impossible to do anything against the increasing natural disasters, because the horrendous mass of humanity and all the machinations destroying nature, fauna, and flora, the climate, the waters, and the atmosphere can no longer be stopped.
There would have been plenty of time to prevent the whole thing if you had been listened to in the 1940s and 1950s. And also in the two later decades, when you sent out warnings regarding the impending catastrophes to major public media and radio stations. If the horrendous increase in overpopulation had been stopped worldwide at that time and a decisive birth control introduced, as you propagated as an urgent necessity, then the destructive excesses and machinations against the planet, nature, fauna, and flora, the atmosphere, and the climate could have been contained and stopped at an early stage. Furthermore, the blatant and malignant degeneration of Earth humans would not have become apparent in the way it is today with regard to intrigues. Wars, conspiracies, infiltrations, attacks, assassinations, secret alliances, tricks, surreptitious ways, cunning, finesse, ruses, robberies, uprisings, and plots. Furthermore, not everything would have degenerated in such a way in only about 70 years with regard to fraud, manipulation, obstructionism, secret service machinations, murder and mass murder, manslaughter, wickedness, depravity, vices and addictions of all kinds, weakness of character, naughtiness, immorality, impudence, impertinence, boorishness, and bad behavior. Also discord, strife, terror, unkindness, lack of interpersonal relations, impudence, callousness, impertinence, arrogance, malice, naughtiness, and shamelessness belong to all the degenerations, as well as jealousy and hatred of one's neighbor, hatred of foreigners and races and perversion, and so on. And indeed, there are many other catastrophically bad degenerations in relation to the Earth-human malignant behavior patterns that in the last 70 years or so have taken such a bad turn into the negative. Evil and bad in the majority of Earth humans that an effective cultural degeneration, cultural degeneracy, and cultural neglect has arisen that is still getting worse.
Exactly. And it has really become very bad in that respect. But something else. I am aware of the official version of the killing of Osama bin Laden, as well as what you told me in terms of what really happened. Now it is already 6 years since that happened, So I think that today it is probably no longer necessary to keep quiet about it and that you can say something about it. The official version of the killing of Osama bin Laden on the night of the 2nd of May 2011 is that a team of U.S. Navy SEALs flew by helicopter from Afghanistan at low altitude to Abbottabad in Pakistan, a mountain town about 60 kilometers as the crow flies north of the capital Islamabad. The Special Forces men rappelled into a courtyard of a walled mansion there and found Osama bin Laden. They killed the head of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, took the body with them, and transported the world's most wanted man to the Arabian Sea from an aircraft carrier the same day. The Pakistani government was only informed about the operation when the helicopters had already entered Pakistani airspace. However, the whole of this does not correspond to the effective truth, as you said, because in reality, everything happened differently, and the entire facts were and are completely different from those presented by the USA. Also, what effectively happened after the action was dressed up in unbelievable lies, which
Not to mention yet, because the time is not ripe for that, because I think that you want to disclose what I had to say and disclose regarding the truth in the interview report. But it is too early for that, and it would even be dangerous for you if we were to tell the truth now about what really happened. It is a fact that the information and the presentation of the White House and the U.S. government at that time did not correspond to the real events and did not correspond to the truth, just as this is not the case today, which also means that U.S. President Barack Obama publicly lied when he had the action broadcast to the world as a U.S. unilateral action and the American hero story by the media. According to our direct observations of the events, as I have explained them to you, the USA informed the Pakistani government in Islamabad early on about the planned action and made the exact clarifications known to it, as well as to General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, the head of the Pakistani army. The USA also effectively informed General Ahmed Shuja Pasha, the head of the ISI military intelligence service, so that all Pakistan's key personalities were in the loop. So Pakistani generals also knew about the Abbottabad residence of Osama bin Laden, who lived just a kilometer away from the highly secured military academy, where he was kept under house arrest. He lived there from 2001 to 2006, together with his wives in the Pakistani part of the Hindu Kush, where, however, tribesmen had betrayed him to the Pakistani security forces against payment of an immense betrayal sum. Pakistan, however, tolerated Osama bin Laden because after his arrest in the villa in Abbottabad, the Saudi Arabian government paid large sums of money to Pakistan for him in return for the Saudi Arabian citizen not being deported and being able to live in safety. In addition, the Saudis pushed the Pakistanis hard not to reveal the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan to the USA, but in the end, a Pakistani intelligence agent for a horrendous trader's fee in the tens of millions of dollars informed the CIA about the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. The U.S. government concealed this development from the Pakistan government and initially, of course, did everything possible and set in motion to verify the information betrayed to them, precisely whether it was effectively Osama bin Laden. But then, when it was certain that the traitor information was correct and everything was clear, the U.S. government put pressure on the Pakistan government and threatened to cut off billions in military aid to Pakistan if nothing was done against Osama bin Laden. And part of this threat was that funding for bulletproof limousines would also be stopped, as well as security personnel for the ISI leadership, etc., which of course Pakistan agreed to. Further, senior Pakistani officers had received strangely large bonuses from unregistered U.S. Pentagon coffers. But not enough with these threats of pressure, because in order to push them even higher, there were also threats to make public the fact that Osama bin Laden lived in Abbottabad in Pakistan, where he enjoyed military as well as governmental protection, with the knowledge of the Pakistanis. So the fact was, Osama bin Laden's villa was in the middle of a militarily secured zone. And when the U.S. Special Forces with attack helicopters, their loud engine noises echoing far and wide through the night, and these had also been heard in the Pakistani military camp, that no one reacted. So the military stationed in the camp did not keep a lookout, because on orders they did nothing about the U.S. attack on Osama bin Laden. Effectively, they remained unusually quiet, as a result of which the U.S. Special Forces were able to carry out their operation, which would not have been possible if the Pakistan government and the military were not in the loop and not committed to silence. These facts, however, are vehemently denied by both the U.S. and Pakistan, just as the related written reports of both states have been largely distorted, so that the truth should not be inadvertently made public through treachery or other unwelcome circumstances. But what emerged with regard to the effective truth, precisely with regard to the action against Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, as well as everything else that resulted from it, should not be spoken about openly even today, because it would be very dangerous.
Thanks. What you have explained should actually be enough to expose how perfidiously the USA denies and outrageously falsifies many things over and over again. And when I think about the fact that as a result of this, unpleasant, nasty and ill-considered words against U.S. America and the U.S. people are repeatedly uttered by many human beings, unfortunately including the entire U.S. population, then I find this extremely regrettable. This is precisely because the righteous U.S. Americans, about half of the U.S. American people, have nothing to do with the dirty machinations of the government. Its secret services, the military and its supporters from the people, and also do not agree with everything they do, and wrongly consider to be good in their ignorance. This is also the case with the death penalty, which is opposed by about half of the U.S. population and against which there are repeated demonstrations. I also find it lousy that in the USA the poor are treated like dirt and have to live miserably because the state does nothing for them. It was also like that in Switzerland in earlier times, but that has changed over time, although the whole thing is also reappearing in similar forms in Helvetia today. Once upon a time, the poor in Switzerland were not allowed to enter a tavern or marry, and if they violated this, they ended up in institutions and lost their civil rights. And this is still not history, no, because today the poor are being increasingly harassed again. And this is so, while the managers and bosses of banks, big companies and corporations, etc. receive a multi-million bonus and a multi-million additional remuneration every year and can live a life of joys and glories, sanctioned by the stupid shareholders. This, while the poor have to turn over every penny 3 or 5 times before they can spend it to be able to buy what is necessary for them, and, in addition to this, have to live very meagerly, perhaps even suffer from hunger, are ill and possibly have to live in shacks or even live on the streets as marginalized people. And this is not only the case in Germany, France, England, the USA, and other countries, but shamefully also in rich Switzerland, where financially underprivileged old human beings live in homes and have to live in poverty with regard to many things that the majority of the population does not care about.
I am aware of that because you once talked about it and also said that you supply 1 or 2 old people's homes with fruit 4 times a month, which you pay for yourself.
Yes, that's true, but for some time now Pius has also been contributing a mite every month. And in addition, he personally brings the fruit to the old people's homes every Tuesday, working in one of them as a carer, and he always reports how much the old people are pleased and grateful for the fruit. I would like to give more, but I have a family to take care of.
Of course, and I therefore know what you are doing in this regard and also for the mission.
We should not talk about that because on the one hand it is my human duty, and on the other hand I just cannot help it, because I do not only see myself, but also my fellow human beings. Just also those who are old and poor and have even less than I do. But I have to say that I like to help. But I only do it directly and not through begging aid organizations. Because on the one hand they are allowed by law to collect at least 40% of begged money for their own expenses, etc., and to pay themselves with it, while many other percentages disappear into the dark channels and pockets of those responsible in those countries for whose suffering populations the donations of the gullible donors are basically intended. These gullible donors do not know that when they give, for example, 1 franc or euro for the needy, in most cases only about 40 cents of it reach the needy, if at all. Without exception, all so-called aid workers are eager to get their hands on the donors' money, because they are all unwilling to do their alleged helpfulness in their free time for free. They want to be paid horrendously for it, and effectively enrich themselves with the donations of all those compassionate and righteous fellow human beings who have mercy for the suffering human beings and therefore give a smaller or larger mite to alleviate the distress of those in need of support. In doing so, however, they do not suspect and do not know that about half or even more of their donated money disappears to maintain the aid organizations and to pay the aid personnel. But so does a part, or sometimes even all of it on its way to the needy. And since I know all this from experience, having witnessed in India and Pakistan what happens to collected aid money and relief materials, I do not donate a single cent to any aid organization. In India, for example, I had to collect powdered milk and other food in New Delhi, which was used to feed the dogs on Dog Hill in Marali, while in a Methodist chapel the same food was only given to those believers who had also put enough in the begging box. In Karachi, on the other hand, clothes collected in Switzerland, pressed into heavy bales of several hundred kilos, as well as army items, tents, etc., were bought up by wholesalers and sold on to small traders who resold everything in second-hand shops to the needy. And so I have gathered my experiences in some countries, especially in Africa, where I have seen and experienced enough how sadly those human beings are cheated, who beg horrendous amounts of money in the millions for the needy in third-world countries, etc., of which they also fork out at least 40% for their own wages and exorbitant expenses. Not to mention that collected clothes, etc., are sold and thus additional profit is made, but also that money and all kinds of goods disappear into dark channels in the countries in need of help and enrich criminal elements who hijack everything.
I am also aware of all this, but also the compassionate and good. Helpful and righteous earth humans want to be deceived and cannot be taught even by the truth. Consequently, they can be viciously exploited through various begging and tear-jerking schemes.
Well said. The current political and military-political world situation is once again disastrous. Because the USA, as it has been doing since time immemorial, is working on starting another war, once again in North Korea, where it already took a beating during the Korean War together with the UN troops. In this regard, I have done some research and studied the facts of the time. The Korean War was a conflict between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea, whereby the People's Republic of China was also involved on the North Korean side, and on the other side, in addition to the Republic of Korea or South Korea, UN troops under the leadership of the USA. Both Korean regimes emerged from the Soviet and American occupation. Zones after the Third World War, 1939 to 1945, seeing themselves as the only legitimate successors to the Korean Empire annexed by Japan in 1910. North Korea, however, wanted to force the reunification of Korea under its own leadership at all costs. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean troops attacked South Korea, with American forces under General MacArthur initially providing the requested assistance to the South Korean troops. After UN troops were also placed under MacArthur's command, the national conflict expanded into a vicious war, which quickly spread with international participation. With the intervention of the USA and later China, this became a proxy war, whereby this conflict caused such great fears, especially in Germany, that the whole thing could have led to a Fourth World War, whereby, of course, there was talk of a Third World War. This is precisely because the First World War of 1756 to 1763 is being concealed as such and declared as a 7-year war, because the USA wants to be off the hook and denies that it effectively instigated one or the First World War at that time. Well, the UN troops under the leadership of the USA, namely under the command of General MacArthur, who was celebrated as a great hero when he returned to the USA, after the lost war, were initially pushed back by the North Korean troops to a small bridgehead around Busan in the south of the Korean peninsula. Afterwards, however, they advanced in a counteroffensive far beyond the demarcation line to the Chinese border in the north. However, this second advance was not covered by UN Security Council Resolution 85. Then, at the end of October 1950, strong Chinese volunteer units on the North Korean side intervened in the fighting and, in fierce and murderous battles, drove back the UN troops and thus also the troops of the USA. After which the front stabilized approximately in the middle of the peninsula, namely at the 38th parallel, where a very loss-laden war of position was fought. By the end of the war, about 940,000 soldiers and about 3 million civilians had been killed on all sides. Almost the entire industry of the country was also destroyed in this war. 2 years of negotiations led to an armistice agreement on the 27th of July 1953, which largely restored the status quo ante, or the way things were before. After the war, all efforts to reunite the two Koreas failed completely, aided by the military conflict, which, due to the division of the country, was unable to solidify it as one state. Until 1958, China's troops remained in North Korea, while U.S. troops are of course stationed in South Korea to this day. Because once the U.S. has established itself in a country, it annexes it, or remains as an occupying power, which it then declares to be a protecting power. And what has happened so far, as you can see and hear in the daily news, is also that no peace treaty has been signed between North and South Korea. And now the USA is working in Korea again and is about to start a new war because of the machinations of the North Korean mad psychopath and power maniac Kim Jong-un.
What you say was and is indeed so. But the figures of 940,000 soldiers killed and about 3 million civilians correspond to mendacious claims of the UN and the US. Because according to our very accurate records we kept during the whole period of this war, which I can retrieve if you please, wait for a moment. Yes, here, these are the dates. These show that during the entire course of the war, 1,364,829 of all the armed forces involved were killed, while 3,716,411 civilians lost their lives as a result of the acts of war, and that includes men as well as women and children.
Many unrighteous, power-obsessed, war and terror-loving state leaders and their henchmen, as well as power-obsessed military leaders are around the world in many states, who decide and act arbitrarily over the heads of their populations, and deny all general rights to all persons or human beings of the peoples who are righteous, and stand in all civil honors, duties and rights, so also the totality of the state-established or recognized norms of human and social behavior, as also the totality of laws and law-like norms as well as the entire legal system. For citizens in certain states, even the freedom to profess their religious faith is dangerous to life and limb, as is also the case with the freedom of thought and opinion, which may not be cultivated. And it is even worse when personal views regarding politics and state leadership as well as military actions, etc. are mentioned, because this can be quite dangerous to life. Instead of guaranteeing political rights and free and fair elections, independent courts, freedom of confession and personal freedom of choice, everything is either put under criminal law or violently suppressed from the bottom up. In this way, the fundamentally state-established or recognized norms of human behavior are suppressed for the individual human being as a whole, whereby the whole of the laws and law-like norms and the whole legal system are disregarded, and in reality the whole of freedom is in every respect only a sham and a deception. It is always shocking how easy it is for unscrupulous and irresponsible rulers to incite their populations against other peoples in order to wage wars against them and unthinkingly sacrifice their lives for it. The high-handed and conscienceless state powers, by which I mean those who instigate wars, order them and have them carried out by the military, must, in order to be able to organize the war arms races, suggestively convince the majority of their population that waging war against hostile states and their militaries, and thus also the killing of other human beings, is just and necessary. Since time immemorial, Those obsessed with power have devised many different justifications for this, and over the centuries and millennia they have repeatedly reconstructed them, built them up and suggested them to their populations out of cowardly fear, as well as out of hatred, a desire for conquest, quarrels, greed for annexation because of land expansion or religious disputes, and so on. In modern times, too, it is still the same cowardly fears, but especially the Earth's resources such as oil, metals, rare earths, uranium, gold and platinum, etc., which are stolen and brought under control by force of war and arms. Today, however, it is a question, as it has been again and again since time immemorial, as it was also in the Nazi World War, of genocides or exterminations of groups, peoples, and religious communities being carried out by war. The whole warfare is then presented in such a way that the so-called enemy countries, etc., are in imminent danger. The whole warfare is then presented in such a way that there is imminent danger from the so-called enemy countries, etc., which must be counteracted because attacks and terrorism are allegedly threatening one's own country, as a result of which an oppositional or resistant course of arms is unavoidable. But the fact is that the whole thing results in bloody and destructive wars and the murder of countless foreign human beings, men, women and children, of other countries that are invaded with war, death, terror, and destruction. And the fact that all the duped human beings of those peoples who, as a result of their stupid behavior, allow themselves to be seduced by their state and military powers into retaliatory strikes and wars and terror, etc., add to this a howl of pro and hurrah and a cry for revenge, clearly shows their lack of intelligence. And the majority of these unthinkingly bellicose peoples are usually also writhing in cowardly fear instead of thinking things through clearly and rationally and refusing from the bottom up to comply with the bellicosity of their state powers and military might. If the majority of a population or the entire people would courageously refuse to doggedly submit to the war and terror misconduct of their state and military powers and even depose them, then they would have no power and also no army that would dance to their tune. This, however, requires the courage of the majority or the entire population, because if the people really determine what has to be and must be, which of course must also include the various types of henchmen of the rotten state leaders and the military, then all those in power are powerless. But the peoples, on the one hand, because they themselves are lazy, indifferent, and effectively stupid, are only too willing to be influenced by suggestion, and, on the other hand, they become pro and pro-hate criers and even worshippers and slaves of all those criminal state and military powers that spread wars. Misery as well as death, ruin and destruction at the expense of the lives of the populations. But it is also the case that entire peoples willingly allow themselves to be intimidated because they are afraid and dare not speak the truth, allow themselves to be oppressed out of cowardice and offer no resistance. But it is also the case that the majority of all peoples have never learned since time immemorial to be courageous, to speak their own minds and to state clearly that they want peace in peace, freedom and humanity. So the majority of all earthly peoples in all states of the earth truly live in timidity, anxiety, self-consciousness, depression, trepidation, cowardice, fear, rabbit-heartedness, pusillanimity, sissiness, despondency, pusillanimity, pessimism, timidity, weak-heartedness, lowness, despair, exaggerated caution, fickleness, wimpishness, timidity, and false reserve. At the same time, countless men also display a profound unmanliness, whereby they also show a shameful wimpishness in front of themselves, which they try to conceal with pompous speeches, self-aggrandizement, stupid and primitive sayings, as well as with vulgar, immoral and vulgar ways of speaking and expressing themselves. But in doing so, they are so intelligenceless and stupid that they do not perceive their own ridiculousness in this respect. It is this kind of human beings who go along with the bulk of all those who, as suggestible people, allow themselves to be willfully charmed by the authorities, state powers and military powers, and by all their suggestive influences, who build up hatred within themselves against foreign human beings and countries. And in doing so, They do not notice that they are being shamefully manipulated by those state leaders and military fanatics who do not strive for the well-being of their peoples, but who want to live out their megalomania, their self-importance, and might as well as their striving for war and terror in an absolutist manner. And if, in addition, these foreign human beings and states are slanderously declared enemies and enemy states by their leaders and militaries and xenophobes as well as racists and religious agitators, and consequently the manipulated peoples get involved in the madness of war and killing, then this basically requires a very great stupidity and cowardice on the part of those influenced. And this fear and cowardice, as well as the hatred and desire for revenge suggested to the majority of all citizens, do not remain without effect, because the suggestively processed human beings are too simple-minded and incapable of considering the inflammatory and warmongering words spoken to them and of being able to mentally comprehend and understand their consequences. Consequently, they allow themselves to be duped into murderous wars and terror, etc., and fall into a very special, primitive and dog-like submissive obedience to those authorities of state power and the military who criminally conjure up wars and terror and inhumanly hunt countless human beings to their deaths. And this is done by the peoples concerned or their lurkers, who waddle slimily behind those in power, idolize them, and are addicted to these warmongers without understanding or reason, because as followers they are cowardly yes-men, effective-minded louts, sympathizers, turncoats, and cowards, and glorify those in power like gods. And they do this also because they have no respect for themselves, and do not give themselves any credit, but wrongly show respect and esteem in a dog-like submissive manner to the war-demanding dictators or rulers and state powers and military powers, because they are fundamentally worse than stupid and simple-minded herd animals who allow themselves to be torn and driven into misery and death by power-hungry leaders. A certain number of others, however, are opportunists who deceitfully opportunistically align their ensigns accordingly, yet cleverly despite their stupidity and lack of intelligence, in order to ultimately make their own personal big profit out of the whole thing. Consequently, they are only waiting for a favorable opportunity to be the real winners for their own benefit and advantage, to the detriment of all or very many fellow human beings, without regard for consequences, losses, and their own values.
You have, as usual, called a spade a spade. Consequently, I can only confirm your statements and do not have to explain or even say anything further about them.
Someone asked me, because I was given the title Sheikh and the name Muhammad Abdullah, while my ex-wife was given the name Aisha in the same move, whether my ex had appeared with him as a personality other than Aisha at the time of Prophet Muhammad. For my part, I have never bothered about this, and therefore know nothing in relation to her past in this regard. But perhaps you know something because you have been intensely concerned with the past personalities in relation to my ex-wife, as you once mentioned.
During the entire lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, no female or also no male human being existed who would have harbored the spirit form of your former wife. This is what the information of the level Arahat Atharsata indicates.
Thanks. Then something else. You are making medical diagnoses through pure body emanations. So you are practicing something like what is shown in the science fiction movies, like in Star Trek. Are the Earthlings also soon capable of this diagnosis?
According to our clarifications, this has been worked on for quite some time. But so far, no significant findings, let alone successes, have been achieved in this regard. Consequently, the whole thing still needs a lot of efforts and will also take a lot of research and time.
Then a question regarding the strange happenings in my office, because I just have not heard anything from Zafanat Panich and Yanarara. Has anything new come up in this regard?
Unfortunately, no, because the two in a group of specialists working with them are still trying to clarify and research. However, the two will be visiting you in the foreseeable future.
Looking forward to it. Now I have 2 or 3 things I want to discuss with you without any later notes, if you do not mind.
Of course.
Good, then the following.